You have exactly 5 seconds to leave before I call security. The words echoed across the quiet marble lobby with enough force to stop every conversation in the room. Business executives looked up from their laptops, hotel guests lowered their coffee cups, and a concierge froze in the middle of greeting a new arrival. Yet the man standing in front of the reception desk did not move. He did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He simply adjusted the strap of the worn leather portfolio resting against his side and looked calmly at the woman behind the polished counter. His name was Elijah Brooks. He was 48 years old, dressed in dark blue jeans, spotless white sneakers, and a simple charcoal polo shirt that carried no luxury logo. There was nothing about his appearance that suggested private jets, corporate boardrooms, or billion-dollar negotiations. And that was exactly why everyone around him believed they already knew who he was. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe. These stories spark change. And we are glad you are here. Now, back to Elijah Brooks. Outside, a warm Chicago morning reflected across the glass walls of one of the city's most exclusive executive clubs, a place reserved for high-profile investors, Fortune 500 leaders, and invited board members. Inside, every detail projected prestige. Crystal lighting hung above imported marble floors. Soft piano music floated through the spacious lobby. Tailored suits and designer handbags blended naturally into an atmosphere where appearances quietly shaped expectations. The white receptionist folded her arms with visible impatience. She had already decided that Elijah did not belong long before she glanced at the digital confirmation displayed on his phone. "Sir," she repeated with a practiced smile that never reached her eyes, "this private club is only for registered executive members." Elijah answered politely. "I understand. That is why I have a reservation." She barely looked at the screen before sliding the phone back toward him. "Someone must have forwarded you the wrong information." Several nearby guests exchanged quick glances. One elderly businessman frowned slightly, but remained silent. A young financial analyst seated near the lounge entrance quietly removed his headphones, sensing that something about the exchange did not feel right. Elijah remained perfectly composed. Years of experience had taught him that moments like this revealed far more about other people than they ever revealed about him. He rested one hand lightly on the reception counter, not with entitlement, but with quiet patience. "Would you mind checking one more time?" he asked. The receptionist sighed dramatically before tapping a few keys on her computer. Less than 3 seconds later, she looked back up. "There is nothing under your name." Elijah tilted his head slightly. "Did you search the confirmation number?" She paused for only a fraction of a second before answering. "Sir, I know how to do my job." The atmosphere grew noticeably heavier. Conversations faded. Even those pretending not to watch found themselves listening. Elijah slowly slipped his phone back into his pocket, without the slightest hint of frustration. His expression never changed, because deep inside, he already understood something everyone else in that elegant lobby had not yet discovered. The most expensive mistakes are rarely caused by technology. They begin the moment someone mistakes confidence for certainty. The receptionist reached for the telephone, without taking her eyes off Elijah. Her confidence had only grown stronger, because every silent glance from the surrounding guests seemed to validate the conclusion she had already reached. "Security will escort you out if necessary," she said in a calm, but unmistakably firm voice. Elijah answered with the same quiet respect that had defined every word he had spoken since entering the building. "If that is what you believe is appropriate, I will cooperate." His response surprised several people nearby. The young financial analyst, who had removed his headphones moments earlier, leaned forward in his chair. He had expected frustration, or an argument. Instead, he saw a man who remained completely in control of himself, while everyone else seemed increasingly uncomfortable. The elderly businessman folded his newspaper, and quietly watched the interaction unfold without saying a word. Less than a minute later, a tall security supervisor named Daniel Harper stepped into the executive lobby. He greeted the receptionist politely before turning toward Elijah. "Good morning, sir," he said. "I understand there is a problem today." Elijah smiled slightly. "That depends on how we define the word problem." Daniel looked from Elijah to the receptionist, immediately sensing that the atmosphere felt unusually tense. The receptionist quickly explained, "He claims to have executive access, but there is no reservation under his name." "I have already checked." Daniel nodded professionally before looking back at Elijah. "Would you mind showing me your confirmation?" Elijah unlocked his phone and displayed the digital reservation without hesitation. Daniel examined the screen carefully. The reservation looked authentic. The confirmation number followed the exact format used by the executive club. Even the encrypted membership seal appeared genuine. "May I verify this myself?" Daniel asked respectfully. "Of course," Elijah replied. Daniel walked to the reception terminal and entered the confirmation number exactly as it appeared on the screen. The system processed the request for several seconds before displaying an unfamiliar message. Instead of rejecting the reservation, the monitor requested elevated authorization beyond his security clearance. Daniel frowned. During nearly 12 years working security at executive facilities across Chicago, he had never encountered that specific notification. He entered the number again with identical results. Elevated executive authorization required. The receptionist crossed her arms impatiently. "It is obviously a system error." Daniel did not answer immediately. He knew the software almost never produced random authorization prompts. It either rejected invalid reservations or approved legitimate ones. This was something entirely different. Elijah quietly slipped his phone back into his pocket. His expression remained unchanged, as though he had expected this exact sequence of events before he ever stepped inside the building. The young analyst quietly stood and walked closer, under the excuse of refilling his coffee. Other guests also drifted toward the reception area without appearing obvious. Curiosity had replaced indifference. Daniel finally looked at the receptionist. "I believe we should contact executive operations before making another decision." She shook her head with visible frustration. "Why are we wasting time over someone who clearly does not belong here?" Daniel answered carefully. "Because the computer is not questioning his reservation. It is questioning whether we have permission to view it." A heavy silence settled across the elegant lobby. For the first time that morning, uncertainty replaced certainty, and Elijah Brooks remained the only person in the room who appeared completely at peace with whatever was about to happen next. Daniel stepped away from the reception terminal without saying a word. His years in executive security had taught him that unusual computer messages deserved patience rather than assumptions. He entered the confirmation number one final time, carefully checking every digit. The result remained exactly the same. Elevated executive authorization required. He slowly looked toward the receptionist. "I believe we need executive operations." She shook her head in disbelief. "We do not need executive operations. We need to remove someone who clearly does not belong in a private club." Daniel chose his words carefully. "The system has not rejected his reservation." "Then why can nobody open it?" she replied. Daniel answered quietly. "Because someone above my authorization level controls this account." That sentence traveled farther through the elegant lobby than anyone expected. Guests who had been pretending not to watch quietly turned toward the reception desk again. The young financial analyst moved closer, carrying an empty coffee cup that no longer mattered. Even the elderly businessman stood from his chair, sensing that the morning was becoming far more significant than anyone first believed. Elijah remained exactly where he had been from the beginning. His posture stayed relaxed. His breathing never changed. He neither demanded respect nor defended himself. Years earlier, he might have tried explaining who he was. Experience had taught him that genuine character could never be proven through arguments. It revealed itself naturally when people finally stopped making assumptions. The receptionist picked up another telephone and dialed an internal extension. "This is Melissa at the executive lobby," she said. "I need an operations manager immediately. We have a reservation issue that security cannot resolve." She ended the call and folded her arms once again. "Someone will be here shortly." Elijah smiled politely. "Thank you." His calm response seemed almost impossible to understand. Melissa had expected frustration. Instead, every respectful answer only made her own certainty feel less convincing. Several minutes later, the private elevator doors opened. A woman in a tailored gray business suit stepped into the lobby carrying a secure company tablet. Her name badge identified her as Laura Mitchell, Director of Executive Operations. She immediately noticed the unusual silence surrounding the reception desk. "Good morning," she said. "Can someone explain the situation?" Melissa spoke first. "A guest claims to have executive access, but nobody can verify his reservation." Laura accepted the tablet from Daniel and entered her executive credentials into the secure system. The confirmation number appeared on the screen. She pressed verify. Instead of opening the reservation, another message appeared requesting governance clearance beyond executive operations. Laura stared at the display for several seconds. She had worked in executive hospitality for 11 years. She had never personally encountered that level of restricted access. Melissa leaned closer. "It is another system problem, right?" Laura slowly shook her head. "No, then what is it?" Melissa asked. Laura looked toward Elijah for the first time. "It means this reservation belongs to someone whose profile is protected beyond my authority." The lobby became completely silent. Even the quiet piano music drifting through the room suddenly felt distant. Elijah slipped both hands comfortably around his leather portfolio and looked through the towering glass windows toward the Chicago skyline. He had seen this moment before in different cities, different buildings, and different years. The names changed. The furniture changed. The assumptions almost never did. Behind him, Laura quietly reached for her phone. There was only one department left she could contact, and everyone in the lobby instinctively sensed that whoever answered that call was about to change the entire story. Laura stepped several feet away from the reception desk before placing the call. She lowered her voice, but everyone in the quiet executive lobby could still recognize the change in her tone. It was no longer the voice of someone solving an ordinary reservation problem. It was the careful voice professionals used when speaking with people whose authority reached beyond their own. "This is Laura Mitchell from Executive Operations," she said. "I have encountered a restricted governance profile that cannot be opened through executive access." "Yes, the guest is here." "Yes, I have personally verified the confirmation number." She listened silently for several moments before answering, "Understood. We will wait." When the call ended, Melissa immediately stepped forward. "What did they say?" Laura looked at her calmly. "Corporate governance is already in the building." Melissa blinked. "Already here?" Laura nodded. They asked us not to take any further action until they arrive. Daniel quietly exhaled. Everything about the situation suddenly felt more serious than he had imagined. Corporate governance rarely became involved in operational matters unless they concerned executive oversight or board-level decisions. Around the lobby, guests who had gathered out of curiosity exchanged uncertain glances. The young financial analyst leaned quietly against a marble column, unable to take his eyes off Elijah. The elderly businessman smiled faintly to himself. Years of experience had taught him that people who remained calm under pressure usually carried far more confidence than appearances suggested. Elijah stood exactly where he had been from the beginning. He neither checked his watch nor asked how much longer the process would take. Instead, he looked toward the skyline beyond the enormous windows, watching the sunlight spread across downtown Chicago. A memory quietly returned to him. More than 20 years earlier, he had stood outside another executive building carrying nothing but a briefcase filled with resumes. That morning someone had also decided he did not belong before learning his name. The memory no longer filled him with anger. It reminded him why patience had become one of the strongest forms of leadership he possessed. Melissa finally broke the silence. If your reservation really belongs here, why did you not simply ask for a manager immediately? Elijah turned toward her with the same composed expression. Because how people treat strangers tells me more than how they treat important people. No one answered. The sentence lingered through the elegant lobby with surprising weight. Even Melissa seemed unable to dismiss it. Several moments later, the private executive elevator doors opened once again. 3 professionally dressed individuals stepped into the lobby wearing understated identification badges marked corporate governance. They walked with calm purpose, neither hurried nor dramatic. Laura immediately recognized them and stepped forward respectfully. The woman leading the group briefly scanned the lobby before her eyes settled on Elijah. A warm, unmistakable smile crossed her face. "Good morning, Mr. Brooks," she said. "Thank you for waiting." The room fell completely silent. Melissa stared in disbelief. Daniel instinctively straightened his posture. Several guests quietly looked at one another, realizing they had just witnessed the first unmistakable sign that nothing about this morning had been what it appeared. Elijah smiled politely and extended his hand. "Good morning, Natalie. I trust everything is ready." She nodded respectfully. "The board has been expecting you. We sincerely apologize for the delay." At that exact moment, every assumption that had filled the executive lobby since Elijah first walked through the front doors began to collapse under the weight of a truth that had only just started to reveal itself. The silence that followed Natalie's greeting seemed to stretch across the entire executive lobby. Melissa stared at Elijah, as though the elegant marble floor beneath her had suddenly disappeared. Daniel quietly lowered his hands from the defensive posture he had maintained since arriving. Laura looked from Natalie to Elijah, and finally understood why every attempt to verify the reservation had ended with restricted access. This had never been a technical problem. It had been a protection reserved for someone whose identity was intentionally shielded from ordinary operational systems. Natalie stepped beside Elijah with genuine respect. "The board meeting has been prepared exactly as requested," she said. "Everyone is waiting whenever you are ready." Elijah smiled politely. "Thank you. Before we go upstairs, I would like to spend a few more moments here." Natalie immediately understood what he meant. "Of course." Melissa finally found her voice. "I do not understand. Who exactly is he?" Natalie looked toward her with professional composure. "That information will be shared at the appropriate time." The answer only deepened the mystery. Guests who had quietly gathered around the reception area exchanged uncertain glances. The young financial analyst found himself replaying every moment since Elijah first entered the building. Nothing about the man had changed. The same simple polo shirt. The same jeans. The same leather portfolio. The only thing changing now was everyone's perception of him. Elijah slowly turned toward Melissa. His expression carried neither anger nor satisfaction. "May I ask you a question?" he said gently. She nodded almost automatically. "When I first walked through those doors, what made you decide I did not belong?" Melissa hesitated. For the first time that morning, she realized she could not answer honestly without confronting her own assumptions. I believed executive members usually looked different." Elijah nodded thoughtfully. "Different how?" She looked down at the polished marble floor. "More formal. More established." Elijah smiled softly. "Interesting." He did not challenge her. He did not accuse her. He simply allowed the weight of her own words to settle naturally into the silence surrounding them. Daniel quietly observed the exchange with growing admiration. He had expected confrontation after the arrival of corporate governance. Instead, he witnessed something much more powerful. Elijah seemed interested in understanding people rather than defeating them. Natalie glanced discreetly at her watch before speaking again. "Mr. Brooks, corporate governance has also prepared the observation report." Several nearby guests immediately looked toward one another. Observation report. The phrase carried a meaning none of them expected. Elijah nodded calmly. "Good. Then everything happened exactly as it needed to happen." Melissa looked up in confusion. "Observation." Natalie answered before Elijah could speak. "Certain executive visits are conducted without prior announcement so that service culture can be evaluated under authentic conditions." Laura's eyes widened slightly. Daniel slowly understood why Elijah had never introduced himself or requested special treatment. The entire morning had unfolded naturally because he had allowed it to. The elderly businessman smiled quietly from across the lobby. "Sometimes," he said almost to himself, "the most important interviews are the ones nobody realizes they are taking." Elijah heard the remark and offered a respectful nod. Then he looked once more across the elegant executive lobby, where only 30 minutes earlier strangers had quietly judged whether he belonged. Now every face reflected something entirely different. Curiosity had become humility, certainty had become reflection, and the truth waiting just beyond the next elevator ride was about to change far more than a single morning inside one exclusive executive club. Natalie opened a secure folder on her tablet and quietly reviewed several documents before looking back at Elijah. "Everything has been prepared exactly according to your instructions," she said. Elijah nodded once. "Then let us make sure we also honor the most important instruction." Natalie smiled with immediate understanding. "No unnecessary embarrassment." "Exactly," Elijah replied. Melissa listened carefully, confused by the unusual exchange. She had expected someone in Elijah's position to demand explanations, apologies, or immediate consequences. Instead, every sentence reflected patience rather than authority. Daniel noticed the same thing. During years in executive security, he had met powerful people whose first instinct was to announce their status. Elijah had done the opposite. He had hidden it. Natalie addressed Laura quietly. "The governance review will begin upstairs in approximately 10 minutes. Before that happens, we would like to preserve the complete timeline exactly as it occurred." Laura nodded. "The incident log has already been secured." Daniel added, "Every verification attempt has also been recorded automatically." Natalie thanked both of them before turning toward Melissa. Would you please describe what happened from the moment Mr. Brooks entered the lobby? Melissa hesitated. She looked briefly toward Elijah before answering. I believed he was in the wrong place. Natalie asked gently, based on what information? Melissa struggled to respond. I assumed his reservation could not belong to him. Did the computer reject his confirmation? Natalie continued. Melissa quietly shook her head. No. Did he become disrespectful? No. Did he refuse to cooperate? No. Each answer became softer than the one before it. The elegant lobby remained completely silent. The questions were simple, yet they revealed more than any accusation could have. Elijah stood calmly beside the reception desk without interrupting once. The young financial analyst realized he was witnessing leadership expressed through questions instead of speeches. The elderly businessman slowly smiled. Truth often arrived more gently than people expected. Natalie finally closed the tablet. Thank you for answering honestly. Melissa lowered her eyes. I understand now that I reached conclusions before I gathered facts. Elijah spoke for the first time in several minutes. Recognizing that difference is how real growth begins. There was no satisfaction in his voice. Only sincerity. Daniel found himself respecting Elijah even more than before. Power could have ended the conversation immediately. Character allowed everyone the opportunity to understand it. Laura quietly stepped toward Elijah. The executive board is assembled upstairs. They are ready whenever you are. Elijah looked once around the lobby. The same marble floors reflected the morning sunlight. The same luxurious furniture surrounded the guests. Yet the atmosphere had changed completely. Earlier, people had quietly wondered whether he belonged inside the building. Now they seemed to question how easily appearances had influenced their own judgment. Elijah picked up his leather portfolio and smiled politely at Melissa. I appreciate your honesty today. She looked surprised. After everything that happened. Elijah nodded. Honest reflection is always more valuable than perfect appearances. Natalie gestured toward the private executive elevator. As its doors opened, several members of corporate governance stepped respectfully aside, allowing Elijah to enter first. The guests watched in complete silence, realizing that whoever this quiet man truly was, the people waiting upstairs considered his arrival important enough to shape decisions far beyond the walls of one exclusive executive club. The private elevator rose quietly through the building while no one inside spoke. Natalie stood beside Elijah with the same calm professionalism she had shown from the moment she entered the lobby. Across from them, two members of corporate governance reviewed secure documents on their tablets without interrupting the silence. Elijah looked at the changing floor numbers displayed above the elevator doors. Every visit like this reminded him that leadership was never measured by how people treated a chief executive officer after learning his title. It was measured by how they treated an unknown guest before learning anything at all. When the elevator doors finally opened, an elegant executive conference floor stretched before them. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the Chicago skyline. A long hallway led toward a pair of handcrafted wooden doors where several senior executives waited respectfully. As soon as Elijah stepped into the corridor, every executive stood. No applause filled the room. No dramatic announcement followed. There was only quiet respect expressed through simple gestures. Natalie opened the conference room doors. Around the polished table sat members of the executive board, governance advisors, and senior hospitality leaders from across the organization. Elijah greeted each person with a warm smile before taking his seat. Good morning, everyone, he said. Thank you for your patience. The chairwoman of the board smiled respectfully. We appreciate you conducting another observational visit. Elijah placed his leather portfolio on the table. The observations never become easier. Several board members nodded because they already understood why. Natalie connected her tablet to the conference display. The first slide appeared with a simple title: Executive Hospitality Observation Report. Beneath it appeared the exact arrival time from that morning together, with a complete timeline recorded automatically by the company's systems. Every verification request, every access attempt, every internal call, and every operational response had been preserved without alteration. Elijah quietly reviewed the timeline before looking around the room. Before we discuss the details, he began, I want to establish one principle. This review is not about finding someone to blame. It is about discovering whether our culture reflects the values we claim to represent. The room remained completely attentive. One board member asked, would you like us to identify your position before reviewing the findings? Elijah slowly shook his head. Not yet. Another executive looked surprised. The employees downstairs still do not know. Natalie answered calmly. No. They only know corporate governance responded to a restricted profile. Elijah folded his hands together. That is intentional. The moment people learn who I am, their behavior changes. I am interested in understanding who they are before that happens. The chairwoman smiled thoughtfully. That has always been your philosophy. Elijah nodded. Respect that depends upon status is not respect. It is strategy. Those words settled across the conference room with quiet force. Natalie advanced to the next slide, showing service standards adopted by the organization years earlier. Every guideline emphasized dignity, professionalism, curiosity, and equal treatment. Elijah looked carefully at the screen before speaking again. Policies are easy to write. Character is much harder to measure. Through the glass walls of the conference room, the Chicago skyline stretched into the distance beneath the bright morning sun. Downstairs, the executive lobby slowly returned to its ordinary rhythm. Yet unknown to everyone standing below, the conversation now beginning upstairs would soon reveal a truth powerful enough to transform not only one employee's understanding, but the culture of the entire organization. Natalie advanced to the next slide, and a detailed timeline filled the conference room display. Every event from the morning appeared in precise chronological order. Arrival time. Verification request. Security notification. Executive operations response. Corporate governance contact. Every action had been recorded automatically, without interpretation or opinion. Elijah remained silent while the board members studied the information. After several moments, the chairwoman looked toward him. Would you like to begin with the service timeline, or the identity disclosure? Elijah answered calmly. The timeline first. Identity changes how people feel. Facts change how people think. Natalie nodded and enlarged the first section of the report. At 8:39 in the morning, Mr. Brooks entered the executive lobby, with a valid confirmation number generated through our governance scheduling system. The reservation authenticated successfully. The only restriction was profile visibility, which required governance clearance. One director adjusted his glasses and looked carefully at the screen. So the reservation was never invalid. Correct, Natalie replied. The reservation remained valid from the first second. Another board member asked, then where did the process fail? Natalie selected another section of the report. The operational failure did not begin with technology. It began with assumptions made before verification procedures were completed. The room remained quiet. Elijah folded his hands on the conference table before speaking. Technology did exactly what it was designed to do. It protected confidential information. Human judgment failed because confidence replaced curiosity. Several executives slowly nodded. The observation reflected years of leadership experience distilled into one simple sentence. Natalie continued reviewing the report. Mr. Brooks never refused instructions, never raised his voice, never interrupted staff, and cooperated with every request made throughout the observation. One director looked surprised. Not even after security arrived. No, Natalie answered. Every interaction remained respectful. Elijah looked briefly toward the skyline, beyond the conference room windows before continuing. Respect that depends upon receiving respect first is only a transaction. Leadership requires offering it even when it is not immediately returned. The chairwoman quietly smiled. That is precisely why these observations continue to matter. Natalie displayed another document containing the organization's hospitality principles. Every line emphasized professionalism, dignity, fairness, and equal treatment. She highlighted one sentence near the center of the page. Every guest deserves respectful service before assumptions are formed. Elijah looked at the statement for several seconds. Policies like these look impressive framed on conference room walls, he said. The real question is whether they remain alive at a reception desk during an ordinary Tuesday morning. No one answered because everyone understood exactly what he meant. Downstairs, Melissa continued welcoming arriving guests. Each greeting sounded noticeably warmer than it had earlier that morning. Daniel quietly noticed the difference, but said nothing. Laura reviewed several operational reports, while occasionally glancing toward the private elevator, aware that an important decision was taking shape several floors above. Back inside the conference room, Natalie closed the service timeline and opened one final secure document. Unlike the previous reports, this file remained hidden until every board member entered an additional authorization code. The title slowly appeared across the display. Executive Identity Verification. Several directors looked toward Elijah with quiet anticipation. The chairwoman took one slow breath before speaking. I believe the organization is now ready for the final stage of today's review. Elijah gave a calm nod. Then let us reveal the truth only after everyone has fully understood the lesson. The room fell silent once more, knowing the next few minutes would transform an ordinary observation into a defining moment for the entire organization. Natalie entered the final authorization code, and the secure document slowly expanded across the conference room display. The first page contained only a single photograph. It was the same man who had stood quietly in the executive lobby wearing dark jeans, white sneakers, and a charcoal polo shirt, while strangers questioned whether he belonged. The next page displayed his full executive profile together with the organizational structure beneath it. Elijah Brooks, Chairman and Chief Executive Officer. Every division inside the executive hospitality network ultimately reported through the office he led. Although everyone seated around the conference table already knew the truth, the moment still carried unusual weight, because it represented the final piece of a lesson that had begun downstairs hours earlier. The chairwoman looked toward Elijah with quiet respect. Your identity verification has now been formally entered into today's governance record. Elijah nodded gently. Thank you. Natalie advanced to another page, showing the Executive Observation Initiative approved months earlier. Mr. Brooks personally requested that his visits remain unannounced whenever operationally possible, she explained. His objective has never been to evaluate how employees treat executives. His objective has always been to understand how employees treat people they believe have no influence. One board member leaned back thoughtfully. That distinction changes everything. Elijah smiled slightly. It changes everything because it reveals everything. Downstairs, the executive lobby continued operating normally. Melissa welcomed another arriving guest with a genuine smile before verifying the reservation carefully and respectfully. Daniel quietly observed the interaction from several feet away. He noticed that she now began every conversation with curiosity instead of conclusions. Laura also recognized the change. Sometimes growth happened long before formal training ever began. Back upstairs, Elijah stood and slowly walked toward the panoramic windows overlooking downtown Chicago. Morning sunlight reflected across the city's glass towers while traffic moved steadily below. Without turning around, he addressed the room. When I was 24 years old, I attended my first executive interview carrying borrowed shoes and an inexpensive briefcase. Before anyone asked about my qualifications, someone decided I did not fit the image they expected. The conference room remained completely silent. That experience stayed with me, Elijah continued. Not because it prevented my success, but because it taught me how easily people confuse appearance with ability. He turned back toward the board with the same calm expression he had carried throughout the morning. Today was never about proving that I belonged in that lobby. I already knew I belonged. The real purpose was discovering whether our culture still remembered that every guest deserves dignity before anyone knows their title. Several board members quietly nodded. Natalie closed the executive identity file and opened the final section of the governance report. The observation is now complete, she said. Only one remaining step requires Mr. Brooks' approval. The chairwoman looked toward Elijah. Would you like the employees downstairs informed immediately about your position? Elijah paused for a thoughtful moment before answering. Yes. But only after they first understand what actually happened. He looked once more at the timeline displayed across the screen. If people remember only that the man in the lobby was the chief executive officer, they will miss the most important lesson. The lesson is that the right thing to do should never depend upon knowing who someone is. Every person in the conference room understood that the conversation waiting downstairs would not simply reveal Elijah's title. It would reveal whether the organization possessed the courage to learn from the truth that had quietly unfolded before everyone's eyes. The private elevator descended quietly toward the executive lobby while Elijah stood beside Natalie in complete silence. Neither of them felt the need to rehearse what would happen next. The purpose of the morning had never been to surprise anyone. It had been to reveal whether the organization's values remained consistent when no one believed they were being evaluated. As the elevator doors opened, conversations in the lobby gradually faded. Melissa looked up from the reception desk and immediately recognized Natalie returning with Elijah. Daniel and Laura also stepped forward, sensing that the review had reached its final stage. Several guests who had witnessed the earlier exchange remained nearby, quietly curious about the outcome. Natalie addressed the room with calm professionalism. Thank you all for your patience this morning. We would like to clarify the circumstances surrounding today's observation. Every eye turned toward Elijah. He remained standing a respectful distance from the reception desk, carrying the same leather portfolio, wearing the same charcoal polo shirt, dark jeans, and white sneakers. Nothing about his appearance had changed. Only the understanding of everyone around him was about to change forever. Natalie continued. The reservation presented this morning was authentic from the moment it was submitted. The restricted access messages displayed by our systems were intentional security protections. They were never system errors. Melissa lowered her eyes. Daniel remained perfectly still. Laura folded her hands quietly in front of her. Natalie paused briefly before speaking again. Mr. Elijah Brooks serves as chairman and chief executive officer of this organization. A profound silence settled across the executive lobby. The young financial analyst slowly removed his glasses, almost unable to believe what he had heard. The elderly businessman smiled gently, as though the revelation simply confirmed what Patience had already suggested. Melissa looked toward Elijah with genuine disbelief. The man she had confidently believed did not belong had been the highest-ranking leader in the company from the very beginning. Elijah stepped forward, not to stand above anyone, but to stand where every person in the lobby could see him equally. His voice remained calm and measured. "Please do not remember today, because you discovered who I am." He allowed the sentence to settle before continuing. "Remember today, because none of you knew who I was when the first decisions were made." No one interrupted. "If respect only appears after someone learns a title," Elijah continued, "then respect is no longer a value. It becomes a reward reserved for power." Melissa slowly lifted her eyes. "I am truly sorry," she said quietly. "I believed I was protecting the standards of this place." Elijah nodded gently. "I believe your intention was to protect the organization. My hope is that, from today forward, we protect every person's dignity with the same commitment." Daniel quietly reflected on every decision made that morning. Laura looked around the lobby and noticed that every guest seemed equally thoughtful. Natalie closed her tablet before adding one final observation. The purpose of today's review was never to embarrass an employee. It was to strengthen the culture we all represent. Elijah smiled warmly at Melissa. "Growth begins the moment we replace assumptions with curiosity." The tension that had filled the executive lobby since early morning quietly disappeared. In its place remained something far more valuable. Understanding. Every person standing there realized that the greatest lesson had never been about recognizing a chief executive officer. It had been about recognizing the humanity of a stranger long before anyone knew his name, his position, or the authority he quietly carried behind an ordinary smile. The executive lobby remained unusually quiet even after the formal announcement ended. Guests who had arrived expecting an ordinary business morning now found themselves reflecting on something much larger than a luxury membership or an executive title. Elijah looked around the room one final time before speaking again. His expression carried warmth instead of authority. "Every organization writes mission statements," he said calmly. "Very few organizations discover whether those words survive ordinary moments." Natalie stood beside him with the governance report held neatly against her side. She understood that Elijah was no longer addressing one employee or one department. He was speaking to everyone fortunate enough to witness what had happened. Melissa slowly stepped out from behind the reception desk. For the first time, that morning she no longer stood behind a polished counter separating herself from arriving guests. She stood face to face with Elijah, as one professional speaking honestly to another. "I have been thinking about every decision I made today," she said quietly. "None of them were based on facts. They were based on what I believed someone important should look like." Elijah listened carefully without interrupting. "Thank you for saying that," he replied. "Growth begins the moment we recognize the difference between observation and assumption." Daniel folded his hands in front of him. "I have worked security for many years," he admitted. "Today reminded me that protecting a building and protecting a person's dignity should never become separate responsibilities." Elijah nodded with appreciation. "Exactly. Security protects people first. Buildings simply happen to surround them." Laura smiled thoughtfully as she looked across the lobby. "I believe this morning will change the way our entire executive hospitality team approaches every guest." Natalie opened the governance folder once more and addressed everyone present. "The review has concluded with one central recommendation, approved unanimously by the board. Every employee will receive additional leadership development centered on respectful communication, conscious decision-making, and curiosity before conclusion." Every executive will also participate in unannounced observational visits, so leadership experiences the organization exactly as guests experience it. Several guests quietly nodded in approval. The elderly businessman smiled warmly at Elijah. "Young man, I have attended board meetings for decades. I have seen impressive presentations and remarkable financial reports. Yet I believe the most valuable lesson I witnessed today happened before anyone realized who you were." Elijah returned the smile. Those moments are always the ones that matter most. The young financial analyst stepped forward respectfully. "Sir, I hope one day I lead people the way you did today." Elijah answered with the same quiet confidence that had remained constant from the beginning. "Then remember one thing. Never allow another person's appearance to become the first chapter of a story you have not taken time to read." The words settled gently across the lobby. Melissa looked around at the arriving guests, who continued entering through the revolving doors. This time, she greeted each person with genuine warmth, before asking a single question about reservations or memberships. Daniel noticed the difference immediately. Laura noticed it as well. The culture had already begun changing, not because a policy demanded it, but because understanding had replaced assumption. Elijah picked up his leather portfolio and prepared to leave for his next meeting. As he walked toward the exit, the sunlight pouring through the towering glass windows reflected across the marble floor behind him. He never looked back to see whether anyone was watching. He did not need to. The most meaningful change had never been that people finally recognized the chief executive officer. It was that they had begun recognizing the value of every stranger, before discovering who that stranger might become. Several months passed, and the executive club no longer felt quite the same. The marble floors still reflected the morning sunlight, the crystal lighting still illuminated the elegant lobby, and the panoramic windows still overlooked downtown Chicago, yet something invisible had changed. New employees were introduced to hospitality through real conversations, instead of memorized scripts. Experienced managers spent more time observing how guests were welcomed than how quickly transactions were completed. Every greeting now began with the same simple words, spoken with sincerity, before any reservation number was requested. Melissa had become one of the strongest advocates for the organization's new service philosophy. Every morning she reminded herself of a lesson she would never forget. She no longer tried to decide whether someone looked like an executive before asking how she could help. She greeted every guest with the same warmth, whether they arrived wearing an expensive tailored suit or simple everyday clothing. Daniel noticed the transformation immediately. During security briefings, he began reminding new officers that their first responsibility was never to protect prestige. It was to protect people with professionalism, patience, and fairness. Laura expanded the executive observation program across additional locations, encouraging department leaders to experience the organization anonymously instead of relying only on performance reports. She often told managers, "You cannot improve an experience you have never truly lived." Those words gradually became part of the organization's leadership culture. Elijah never spoke publicly about what had happened that morning. He refused interview requests and declined every suggestion that the observation become a promotional campaign. For him, genuine change never required publicity. It required consistency. During quarterly leadership meetings, he quietly reviewed guest experience reports alongside financial performance, because he believed respect carried measurable value even when it could not be placed inside a spreadsheet. One afternoon, several months after the observation, Elijah entered the same executive lobby once again, without notifying anyone in advance. He wore the same charcoal polo shirt, the same dark jeans, and carried the same worn leather portfolio. Nothing about his appearance had changed. As soon as he stepped through the revolving doors, Melissa looked up with a warm smile that carried no hesitation and no assumptions. "Good afternoon," she said sincerely. "Welcome. How may I assist you today?" Elijah returned the smile before answering. "Thank you." That was exactly the welcome every guest deserves. She recognized him only after hearing his voice, yet the realization no longer mattered, because respect had already been given before recognition arrived. Daniel quietly observed the exchange from across the lobby and smiled to himself. Laura happened to walk through the reception area at that very moment and witnessed the entire interaction. Without a single formal presentation or dramatic announcement, the organization had quietly demonstrated that real improvement had taken place. Elijah looked around the elegant lobby one final time. The building itself had not changed. The furniture remained the same. The marble still shined beneath the afternoon light. What had changed was the invisible culture connecting every conversation inside those walls. As he turned toward the exit, he understood that the greatest achievement of the entire observation had never been revealing the identity of a chief executive officer. It had been proving that ordinary moments, handled with dignity and genuine respect, possessed the power to transform an entire organization long after the morning that inspired them had quietly become history. Nearly a year after that unforgettable morning, the executive club had become known throughout the organization for something far more meaningful than its elegant architecture or exclusive membership. Visitors frequently commented on the atmosphere before mentioning the marble floors, the panoramic skyline, or the luxurious furnishings. They spoke about how welcomed they felt from the moment they stepped through the entrance. Every greeting sounded sincere. Every conversation began with curiosity instead of assumption. Every guest received the same dignity before anyone knew their title, profession, or influence. Melissa often reflected on the morning that had quietly reshaped both her career and her understanding of leadership. She no longer remembered it as the day she failed to recognize the chief executive officer. She remembered it as the day she finally understood that respect should never depend upon recognition in the first place. Daniel continued mentoring new security supervisors, reminding them that professionalism was measured not only by protecting facilities, but also by protecting the dignity of every individual who entered them. Laura expanded the observation program to every executive location across the country, encouraging leaders to experience their organizations through the eyes of ordinary guests rather than through executive privileges. The initiative gradually became one of the most respected leadership practices within the company because it measured something no financial report could fully capture. Elijah remained exactly the same man he had been before any of it happened. He still preferred simple clothing over expensive suits whenever possible. He still carried the same worn leather portfolio that had accompanied him through countless meetings over the years. He still believed that genuine authority never needed to introduce itself. During one annual leadership conference, a newly promoted manager asked Elijah what quality had contributed most to his success. The room expected an answer about strategy, innovation, or decision-making. Elijah smiled thoughtfully before responding. Never allow another person's appearance to become the evidence upon which you build your conclusions. The audience remained silent as the words settled into the room. Leadership begins with curiosity, he continued. The moment certainty arrives before understanding, we stop seeing people and begin seeing assumptions. Months later, guests continued walking through the executive club, without realizing they had entered a place forever changed by one ordinary morning and one quiet conversation. They simply noticed that every employee greeted them with kindness, listened carefully, and treated them with equal respect regardless of how they dressed or what position they held. They never knew that those small moments had become the lasting legacy of an observation that transformed an entire culture. As Elijah left the building after another routine visit, he paused briefly outside and looked back through the towering glass windows. Inside, Melissa welcomed a new guest with the same sincere smile she now offered everyone. Daniel assisted a visitor with genuine patience. Laura spoke with department leaders about continuous improvement rather than simple compliance. Elijah smiled softly before walking toward the Chicago skyline, knowing the greatest victory had never been proving who he was. The greatest victory was helping others discover who they could become. Some stories end when the truth is finally revealed. This one truly began the moment people chose to live differently because of that truth. And long after names, titles, and positions faded from memory, one lesson remained clear for everyone who entered those doors. The strongest measure of character is not how we treat those whose importance we already know. It is how we choose to treat the stranger, whose story we have not yet had the wisdom to understand.